Okay, great. Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah, all right. Well, thank you so much for having me here to present today. It's such a pleasure. And as Penny said, my name's Kristina, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher and neuropsychologist working here at Frontier. And I work within the Mind Lab with Professor Myron Irish. I'm going to be talking about some of our recent work, which is really trying to get a better understanding of some of the inflexible and rigid behaviours that can occur in frontotemporal dementia. But to do this, I'm going to start by actually talking about motivational disturbances. So Olivier touched on this briefly, things like apathy and anhedonia, because we think that's actually a really important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about flexibility. Then I'll talk about behavioural rigidity or inflexibility in frontotemporal dementia, what that looks like, and some recent research that we've done in this area. And then I'm going to talk about a new tool that we've developed to try and help us to better assess what this looks like in the person's everyday life. So just to recap, obviously Olivier has done a great job of introducing us all to frontotemporal dementia and the history of it. And we know that we've got the behavioural variant plus the language variant, so semantic dementia and progressive non-fluent aphasia. And I'm really going to be focused on the behavioural variant and semantic dementia today, because these are the two syndromes where we see most of these inflexible behaviours occur. But when we're thinking about motivational disturbances, so both apathy, which is a loss of motivation, and anhedonia, which is a decrease in the ability to experience pleasure or rewards, they're both really common in frontotemporal dementia. And some of the earliest symptoms, so these can be some of the first things that you might notice have shifted in the person as the disease starts. So apathy is really about a reduction in goal-directed behaviour, which we do see in both the behavioural variant of frontotemporal dementia and semantic dementia. And the person might be really withdrawn from their previously enjoyed interests and activities, their social interactions, and even those day-to-day self-care tasks. They just might have a real loss of motivation to do these day-to-day activities. And it is the most common and disabling most common and disabling non-cognitive symptom of dementia. And it is predictive of functional decline and carer burdens. So it really impacts on the person's ability to participate in their everyday cares and functional activities, and it really has a heavy impact on the carer. So you might see things like the person isn't participating in activities and conversations as much. They might be really blunt or flat in their emotions. So you might not see much change in facial expressions, or they might not express there might not be much of a range of emotions that they're expressing. They might seem just not concerned with their own or other people's behavior. They might be socially withdrawn. But at the same time as this loss of motivation, they can still be quite impulsive. So we can still see disinhibition, and the things that they do just may not be well thought out. They've sort of just acted on an impulse or said something that they hadn't thought about. And at the same time as this apathy, people can experience this similar and related symptom called anhedonia. So to understand anhedonia, it's really important to understand that most of our behavior is driven by the need to experience, or the desire to experience, some sort of pleasure or reward. So we like to do things that we enjoy and give us some form of enjoyment. And so some of these rewards are called primary rewards, and they hold some kind of biological value, like food and sex. These are essential things for, the human race to continue. Whereas secondary rewards still give us that feeling of pleasure and enjoyment, but they don't have that immediate biological value. So they're the different types of rewards and how we break them down. And these experiences stimulate what we call hedonic hotspots in the brain. So there's certain parts of the brain that become active when we're thinking about doing these things, when we're experiencing them, and that gives us that feeling of enjoyment or pleasure in the moment. Whereas in anhedonia, they have a real diminished ability to anticipate and to experience that pleasure response when they're exposed to those previously rewarding stimuli. So this is important that it's previously rewarding. So obviously everyone has different interests and activities that they enjoy. Everyone has individual preferences. But in anhedonia, it's really about the things that they used to enjoy just don't bring that pleasure or reward anymore. And there now is quite a lot of evidence that anhedonia is a key symptom in frontotemporal dementia. And it is separable from apathy. So the person can be experiencing anhedonia or apathy by themselves, or some sort of combination of the two symptoms. And just like apathy, it's predictive of functional impairment, especially in semantic dementia, which is some recent work that's come out from our group. So it seems like anhedonia plays quite an important role for that diagnostic group. And so anhedonia, it looks similar to apathy. Again, you'll see that loss of interest in the hobbies and previous pursuits, the social withdrawal, disengagement, a loss of intimacy is a big one as well, changes in sexual behavior, and an insensitivity to loss as well, because, you know, things like money, they just don't hold that value anymore. So they're not as concerned if they lose those things. And so just to kind of hone in the point, these are the two different types of motivational disturbances that we see. They're overlapping but distinct. One of them is really about the motivation and the drive to get going and do things. One is about the ability to experience pleasure or reward. And these symptoms are linked to what we call the brain's reward circuitry. So this is a series of brain regions, like I said, those hedonic hotspots that are implicated when we're thinking about rewards, when we're working towards a goal or trying to achieve something. These brain regions are really important for all of those behaviors. And we see that these regions are affected. We see atrophy or shrinking in them from very early in the frontotemporal dementia disease course. So it makes sense that we're seeing these symptoms so early in frontotemporal dementia. But at the same time, people with frontotemporal dementia can develop very rigid and inflexible patterns of behavior. And they can put a lot of excessive effort towards these really maladaptive behavioral targets. So there's examples of people insisting on, you know, driving an hour every day or an hour each way, so 2 hours return, to go to a specific store to buy a specific item on a day-to-day basis. We see these types of things happening in frontotemporal dementia. And stopping the person from acting on these behaviors can lead to extreme anxiety and agitation. So again, very challenging for the carers to manage and to deal with. And this can take on a whole range of forms. So there can be obsessive behaviors like clock watching and timekeeping can be something that happens. Insistence on sameness and routine, like I just described. Rituals, so they might be doing everyday tasks, but they have to do it in a very particular way. It might be in a specific order, or, you know, they always have to do one thing before they do the next. It's very rigid around that. They can have some specific and unusual interests, like they can suddenly become really preoccupied with colors, puzzles, numbers, and even religion is one that's come up quite frequently. You might also see verbal and motor stereotypies. So these are repeated things that sort of verbal sounds or motor behaviors that are repeated frequently, but they don't hold any function. So they might repeatedly use catchphrases. They might do some tapping, lip snapping, pacing. That's some examples of stereotypies. And hoarding as well is another symptom that's been reported in frontotemporal dementia. So this is just a whole range of the different types of inflexible behaviors that we see. But what we find really interesting is that this occurs alongside such profound changes in motivation with the apathy and the anhedonia. So how is it that they can put so much effort into these very specific behaviors that don't really have an adaptive function while they can't be bothered with their regular activities and pursuits and their self-care tasks and interacting socially. And that can be very frustrating and perplexing for carers when there's such a withdrawal in so many areas of life, but then there's so much energy put into this very specific behavior or activity. And we recently proposed that changes in motivation, like apathy and anhedonia, might actually contribute to some of these repetitive behaviors. And I've got this kind of fancy framework here. I won't go into it in too much detail, but essentially we thought that in the case of anhedonia, if people aren't getting that feeling of reward from so many of their regular activities, but there are a few little remaining activities that they can still get a little bit of enjoyment or reward from, it makes sense that they're going to repeatedly do those things because that might be the only thing that they still enjoy. It might also be that they need to do it more to get that feeling of enjoyment. So while someone might typically just have to do an activity once to get that feeling of accomplishment and reward afterwards, they might have to repeat that several times to get that same feeling. So that was one way that we thought it might be contributing. We also thought, particularly in semantic dementia, so the people with semantic dementia have this real loss of just general knowledge and knowledge that they've acquired throughout their lifetime. And part of that might be a loss of knowledge about the activities that they used to find enjoyable or alternative activities that they can do. And so when they can't think of things to do, they're reliant on their recent memories to kind of guide them of what to do next. So for example, if you're thinking, where am I going to have lunch today? If you don't have that conceptual knowledge of these are all the different cafes that I like and the areas that I like to go to, what did I do yesterday? I went to this specific cafe. Let's go there again. So we thought that could be two mechanisms that are sort of feeding into this cycle of the repetitive behavior. But we wanted to put that to the test with some real data. So we did run a study looking at the relationship between motivational disturbances and rigidity in frontotemporal dementia. So 71 participants participated through Frontier, and a subset underwent a structural MRI, so 54 participants. And so we could link changes in flexibility to atrophy within the brain. And we got the carer ratings of apathy, anhedonia, and rigidity. And so with rigidity, it's a tricky one because we realized when we wanted to look into this that there isn't really any current measure to capture it. So we looked at all of the questionnaire data that we already had that, many of you would have completed yourselves, and pulled out the questions that we thought were capturing some of these behaviors that we were seeing. So that's the examples of the types of questions that we're referring to. It's got things like rigid ideas and opinions, strict about routines, clock watching, using the same expression or catchphrase. So it's a little sample of a few of those different types of behaviors, and the carers were rating how often the person was engaging in each of these different activities. And so we wanted to look at the relationship between apathy and anhedonia with rigidity and whether that might differ between the behavioural variant of FTD and semantic dementia, but then also to relate behavioural rigidity to brain atrophy across all of the participants. And so we found that, as we suspected, apathy and anhedonia were predicting rigidity overall. So it's a bit confusing, but for the first graph, more hedonic tone means less anhedonia. So people with better hedonic tone were less rigid, or conversely, people who were more anhedonic were more rigid. Same as with apathy, people who were more apathetic were also more rigid. So that was based on the carer ratings. So we were seeing the overall more motivational problems was associated with greater rigidity. But then when we compared this relationship between the diagnostic groups, we found that anhedonia was predicting rigidity specifically for the semantic dementia group. whereas the relationship, the red line here, that wasn't significant. So it was really something specific about anhedonia in the semantic dementia group that was associated with this rigid and inflexible behaviour. Whereas for apathy, there wasn't any difference between the groups. So apathy had a similar effect on both semantic dementia and the behavioural variant of frontotemporal dementia. But then when we looked at the brain regions that were associated with this rigidity, we found that there were several regions where atrophy or shrinkage associated with the disease was associated with greater rigidity. And that included regions that are involved in executive functioning, which is sort of our high-level thinking skills, memory, and reward. So this really important one is, if I use my mouse, you can see this little region here. This is called the nucleus accumbens, and that's one of the most important regions in that reward circuitry that I showed you earlier. So this region is really important for our ability to experience reward and pleasure. So this was telling us that flexibility or rigidity was associated with changes in that brain region and our ability to experience rewards, which is what we had suspected. So overall, this told us that rigidity is linked to apathy and anhedonia. And while apathy was predicting rigidity in both diagnoses, there was a specific role for anhedonia in the rigid behaviours for semantic dementia. And we have some ideas on potentially what's going on here. So I did mention with anhedonia that we think it could be that there's only a few specific activities that the person still gets that reward or pleasure from, so they narrow in and focus on those. Whereas in apathy, it may be more that it's a way of avoiding effort. So if it's a lot of effort, people with apathy are avoidant of cognitive and physical effort. And part of that is it can be really hard to think of different things to do or what you might like to do each day. And so one way of avoiding that effort is just to do the same thing every time. It's much easier. So that's what we think might be going on there, but we'll have to look at that a bit more in future. Exactly. Yeah. So apathy is, it has different dimensions, but one of the dimensions is about that cognitive effort. So it's even just being able to think of new ideas that is effortful in itself, and people with apathy struggle with that. And those rigid behaviours were associated with atrophy in the regions associated with reward processing, memory, and executive functioning. So yeah, this was really, I guess, as we had suspected, it does seem that there is this clear link between these motivational problems and the rigid and flexible behaviours. So perhaps it's not so perplexing or unusual that they co-occur so much. But in future, we really want to look at the brain regions associated with rigidity across the diagnoses. So here we just grouped both diagnostic categories into the one analysis, whereas we'd like to break it up a bit more and translate these findings into targeted interventions to try and manage some of these behavioural changes. But something, and as I touched on earlier, is that it is really tricky to measure rigidity at the moment. So we were able to pull some items together with the existing data that we had, but we realised this is such a complex, multifaceted construct. There's so many different elements to it. We really need a better way to try and capture it. So that led us to actually develop our own measure of flexibility, which we call the Flexibility in Daily Life Scale, or the FIDDLE, as I'll refer to it as. It's a bit less of a mouthful. And so the FIDDLE, we do ultimately want to use it in frontotemporal dementia, but it's not FTD specific, because inflexibility or rigidity happens across many different neuropsychiatric disorders. I've listed some of them there. So we want it to be able to be used more broadly to try and capture these types of symptoms. And so flexibility broadly refers to our ability to adapt our thoughts and behaviours in response to the situation or to feedback. And so it is a really important adaptive skill to be able to do this as we go through life. And And it's thought to have cognitive and behavioral components. So people can have flexible and inflexible thoughts. They can also have flexible and inflexible behaviors. And it does seem to be multidimensional or multifaceted in nature. So that just means that it seems like, rather than it just being one construct, there's lots of different subcomponents that make up this idea of flexibility. And there are some neuropsychological tasks. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the different types of tasks that your loved ones would have completed when they come into Frontier. And there are some that are trying to look at flexibility, but these don't always map on well to the changes that are happening in everyday life. So sometimes people might be very rigid and inflexible in their day-to-day life, and then they can come in and perform really well on these tasks somehow. So we find that questionnaires are potentially preferable for measuring flexibility as it occurs in daily life, particularly for frontotemporal dementia. And so there's a number of questionnaires available for specific diagnoses, particularly around the autism literature, but there's nothing at the moment there was nothing for the multidimensional assessment of flexibility in adulthood, which really limited our ability to assess those symptoms in frontotemporal dementia and to address the questions and address the questions that we want to address. So we aim to develop and validate this new questionnaire for assessing flexibility in daily life using this multidimensional approach. So the questionnaire had 37 items initially, which looked at things like insistence on sameness, preference for routine, those intense interests, rigid ideas and opinions, and also lots of the clinical observations that we'd seen in the frontotemporal dementia population. And so a large group of participants, these were just healthy adults, completed it online. And the reason we started with healthy adults is because even though we want to use this in clinical populations like frontotemporal dementia, it's important to understand what this looks like in the healthy population so we can see where are things changing. So this is always the starting point. And then we did something called factor analysis, which just looks at which the items grouped together and seem to be capturing common themes. So this revealed that there was 5 different factors or dimensions in our scale. So the first one was called repetition, and that's really needing to repeat things until they feel right. Lots of this, and that also included some of those stereotypical behaviors that I spoke about before. Switching, so really being able to adapt your approach and be flexible in the moment and trying out different ways of doing things. Predictability and control was really about needing some predictability and order in your daily life and even in social interactions. So wanting things to occur in a certain way and being able to predict and control that. Routine is pretty self-explanatory, so always following the same route, always doing things in the same order. And thoughts and beliefs, which is these really fixed and unwavering ideas and beliefs. So even if you give someone lots of evidence that they're wrong, there's no changing their mind with this one. And we wanted to look at what these constructs look like across the adult lifespan. Well, firstly, we looked at with any questionnaire, we want to look at whether it's a reliable and valid measure. And I won't bore you with all the details of that, but essentially the scale upheld really nicely. It had good reliability and validity. So that told us that it's a good measure. But the scores had a U-shaped relationship with age. So on here, you've got age down on the bottom axis, on the x-axis, and then fiddle score. And it's a bit confusing, but higher scores actually mean less flexibility, so more problems with flexibility. So this shows us that people were the least flexible in younger and older adulthood, whereas flexibility was peaking somewhere in middle age, so probably at around the 50 years mark, which we thought was really interesting. This is just general population, so in healthy adults. Yeah. Which we were also interested as well because there is a lot of studies will tell you that flexibility declines in age. But it seems more and more that that's not necessarily the case. And a lot of the tasks that they use to measure that, they're based on, speeded reaction times and things. And so naturally older adults might be a bit slower at that, but it's not actually the flexibility that's affected. And that's what we're seeing here. And even if you look at up here, we're getting close to, like, I think the oldest person was about 78 in this study. You can see here that they're actually looking better than the sort of 20-something year olds here. So we're not seeing this decline in flexibility, which was really interesting. And the repetition, routine, and thoughts and beliefs factors had a similar relationship with this U-shaped curve, whereas the switching and predictability and control factors, it was more linear, and it was just a really slight decline with age, but remembering that lower scores are actually better. So that's showing a really subtle improvement in flexibility with age for those scales. So overall, this told us that the fiddle is a valid and reliable tool for assessing flexibility across the adult lifespan. And it is sensitive to these natural fluctuations as we age, which is really important when we want to look at clinical populations, so we can look at specific age groups and figure out what's normal and what's not for that age range. And we have also developed a carer-rated version, which is, of course, really important in our frontotemporal dementia population. And we're currently collecting data using the fiddle in the frontotemporal dementia sample. So our PhD student, Tao, he may have seen some of your loved ones. He has been administering that one for quite some time now. And we've got the self and the carer-rated versions that we're using as well, because we know that in frontotemporal dementia, it's not always the most reliable to get their self-report on these types of things. So that's where carer ratings are extremely valuable. And we think we'll have to look at the data, and I hope by next Carers Day I can give you an update on what this is looking like. But because the fiddle shows that there's this peak in middle age and flexibility, which is actually the time that frontotemporal dementia typically starts, that it will be really useful to detect some of these subtle changes, because if this is the time when people are usually at their most flexible, then any deviation from that is going to be really pronounced and obvious on this measure. So we're hopeful that we can use it in future as a diagnostic tool, but also to help us to better understand what's going on with the inflexibility in this group. What are the mechanisms? What's driving it? Because we need to know that to develop treatment targets for these behaviours. We need to understand them better so that we can, figure out what is the best way to approach them. So some general take-home messages from my talk is that inflexible behaviour is very common in frontotemporal dementia, and it does often co-occur with motivational disturbances, and these may even contribute to or exacerbate the inflexibility, is what we're finding. And they have been linked to changes in the brain's motivation and reward system in frontotemporal dementia. And we've recently developed a new tool to help us to better measure this inflexibility, which we're currently rolling out in frontotemporal dementia, which will help us to better understand the rigid patterns of behaviour shown in this group. And as always, I'd like to finish by thanking Professor Murren Irish and the rest of the Mind Lab and Frontier team, of course, all of the participants and the carers. Some of you may be here today. And please, if you have any feedback or suggestions about any of this work, feel free to email me. My email's down the bottom there. I do also want to point out this QR code. So we recently developed a guide for managing anhedonia in frontotemporal dementia. So it's a QR code. You're welcome to download it. It's got some sort of general day-to-day tips on how to manage some of those motivational changes in FTD. And we're hoping that eventually we can develop something similar for the flexibility and rigidity side of things. So watch this space. But thank you very much.